It is a very special episode of Dialogue Options. No, there will not be crying in a story about drug addiction. I am turning the tables on myself here with former game director for Disney Infinity, Troy Leavitt. Troy is currently on sabbatical from game design, but he has been quite open on YouTube about some of his thoughts and feelings about video games and the inclusion of women and so on. I won't steal his thunder, but Troy is going to ask me some questions today, and I'm very excited about this. Troy, welcome to the program so you can put me on the hot seat.
All right, well, I'm glad to be here, and I've been looking forward to this opportunity for quite some time. I should say, we've never actually met, and the way I discovered you was when I was doing some research on stuff with feminist frequency, and I found your articles where you said, how feminist frequency almost made me quit writing about video games. And that was my first exposure. And I said, well, here's a different take on things than what, I'm seeing presented in the media. And that actually kind of made me think, well, we should talk more to Liana here. We should find out what her thoughts are. And that's how I got into representing you both in my videos and then our little back and forth here offline. So that's kind of how we got here.
Yeah, it was funny because all of a sudden there was this new interest in some of these videos. I'm like, what happened? Normally that's because some MRA group finds my stuff and gets really, really angry at me. And I found out that in this case it's because you had mentioned me in one of your videos. And it's funny because the first thing someone said is, do you know him? I was like,
yeah.
No, I have no idea. But that got me thinking, well, why do they think that somebody needs to be a personal acquaintance of someone to enjoy their work? And I think that's part of the issue, that there is a lot of nepotism in gaming right now. And so people can't trust, for lack of a better term, the authenticity of the voices we have in gaming right now. And that is quite disturbing to me because it's that whole thing they talk about, networking. And how it's probably not overt sexism that explains the hiring gap and all that stuff. It's just women aren't in the pipeline.
Right, and I think that's fair. So I wanted to, and I sent you my list beforehand, but I wanted to ask you some questions. And some of these I feel like I kind of know the answer to, but I wanted to get clarification, right? So we'll put you on the hot seat. So for myself, a lot of times when people say, well, are you a feminist? I always want to say, well, what do you mean by feminism, right? Because I think there are different things. So I want to put that question to you. Are you a feminist? And what does feminism mean to you?
This is a question I get asked a lot. And I do, partially because I'm very stubborn. And I don't think the definitions of other people should inform what I think this is. For many, many years, especially when I was, coming out of the teenage years into early adulthood, I was like, no, I'm not a feminist. I'm an equalist. I'm for equality and all that stuff. And the older I got, the more I started to eat my words and go, you know what? I can say I'm for equality, and I am, but I am not a specialist on, for instance, the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. I have other people who I consult on those issues. The thing I am good at is women's issues in video games, both on the, sort of creative and then on the business side. So then you get into, well, what do you call that? And then we get into this semantics game that I just have no time for. And if you see my past work, I really like F words. So feminist is a thing. I don't really care what somebody calls me, as long as we can work together and collaborate and find some common ground on some of these issues. Because I think that there are issues in gaming affecting both the inclusion of women, and that's sort of the thing we all see and everybody freaks out and has hissy fits about. But we have issues related to this perception of masculinity that connect to the burnout rate, the bogglingly high mental health issues in gaming. It's all this grow a thicker skin, toughen up, raw, real men do this kind of thing. I don't care about your feels. And I think that there's a whole other side to the discussion about what society values. And I think a lot of game devs, because it is so artistic, actually have a lot of qualities that society would consider gender atypical. I also think because gaming's so new, we have a unique potential to avoid some of the stuff that's become kind of calcified or ossified in conventional media, in news, in Hollywood. I think part of the reason that the mainstream media is so hard on games is it's a great distraction as to what's going on in their backyard. Female representation numbers have not meaningfully improved in Hollywood since the 1970s when they started measuring. So on the one hand, I say, well, Hollywood, New York, LA, Chicago, why don't you mind your business and let gaming deal with our issues? But on the other hand, I think there's a real opportunity here for us to do better. And I love it when games just beats linear media at their own games. So there's a
Right.
bit of a vested interest in me as a gamer to lead the way in just beating the pants off every other form of media and showing how awesome games are.
Well, that was one of the things that attracted me to what you're saying, is that you are a real gamer, not a girl gamer, a gamer, right? You play games, you've played them for a very long time, you're very well informed on the different games, and so when you make these criticisms or these insights into various games, I said, well, at least I know she's played that thing. At least I know you're coming from a position of, you know what you're talking about, and that was one of the things where I said, well, if we're going to have, feminist inclined criticism, we should at least be getting it from somebody who knows and understands both games and the gaming industry. So, that was one of the things that I really, found good about you. But the question I kind of want to ask here is do you have any sort of agenda? Do you have any sort of, this is what I would like to see happen, or a pushing thing, or are you just merely analyzing things?
And this is where we get into terms. Agenda usually means some sort of nefarious political um, end goal. And I don't have that. My goal right now is to, first of all, inform and help get some clarity, help create a foundation for this discussion, because I think right now there isn't one. There are all these terms, gaze theory, intersectionalism, gender performance. Gender performance doesn't get enough play as far as I'm concerned. We're really locked into this sort of 1970s style second wave analysis tools. There are reasons for that, but I'll hold off on that. But that's sort of my goal right now. It's to create the fundamentals for a discussion and also to develop tools that actually work in video games. The problem we're having, and I know you're not supposed to use the word problem, but it is. We're using borrowed analytical tools. We're borrowing from cultivation theory, from television. Back in the Jack Thompson troubles,
Right.
we had the whole idea of operant conditioning. And there's all these things that are borrowed from other things, and these transplanted tools don't acknowledge the special nature of video games. When you look at those old cultivation effect studies from the 1980s, started way back in the 1960s, they pre-assumed, an a priori tenet of that was that TV was special. There was something unique and special and powerful about television because, unlike going to the movies, TV came into people's homes. And I
Right,
think
right. Remember that.
this is something that's lacking in the analysis of games, the idea that video games are unique and special and powerful in different ways because they're interactive. Unlike linear media, where the viewer has no outcome has no control over the midpoint, the way the narrative branches, the ending. We have no control over that when we're watching an episode of Criminal Minds where people are getting murdered every week. In a game like Grand Theft Auto, or say the game franchise I prefer, Saints Row, it's a very different paradigm. You can choose whether to use the services of a prostitute. You can choose whether to knife her or run her over when you're done. It is not the same as being a powerless observer. And that's a long-winded answer of this is what I'm trying to do now. Obviously, I have a side benefit. I just don't think I can control this as much as one of the concerns that came out from the people I talked to in Gamergate was that the negative narrative about women in gaming were actually driving women away from the industry. And I think that's very true. And that's why I kind of went, okay, put up or shut up time. Enough being deferent, enough waiting my turn, enough trying to sort of nod respectfully at the people currently doing it. I need to stand up and be counted just to count. I kind of need to show that a woman can have opinions and can word many of them quite strongly. And, the theory was, as long as I knew what I was talking about, people might disagree, but they're not going to troll me into oblivion. And so far, that is working. It isn't that there hasn't been resistance. It isn't that there hasn't been a Kool-Aid point, so to speak. It isn't that people haven't tried to bust me down. But I credit being a gamer to kind of having that, waived combat mode of, okay, cleared that level. Next, come on, restock, get our weapons reloaded. Let's go again, guys. Like, I know this drill. And I think this is important. These are important skills for women to develop, and I think video games have a unique ability to harness healthy aggression in women because we are not socially trained that way as a rule. Sex selective education was something Betty Friedan identified back in '63, and it's a real thing. Girls are socialized significantly different than boys, and it impacts us when we get out in the working world, especially in a corporate environment.
Yeah, I think I wanted to come back to a point that you made earlier that to me really speaks to the difference between video games and what you call linear media. That's participatory nature of it, right? That you're able to interact and make things happen. And to me, everything flows from that. That's what makes a game different than television or movie. And that's also, I think, part of the reason that we as gamers have such an issue with our representations in media, because they go and they cherry pick these instances of where somebody's made a choice to do something really atrocious, or they've picked, something within a game, and then they show that as an example of what gamers do, when quite often gamers don't do that at all, because either there's a penalty associated with it, or they don't see it as germane to their objectives. So, they're not doing these things. And then people end up with this negative opinion of feminist critiques of video games because they see that representation in the media of, look what gamers are doing. What was the Ashley Judd thing that happened fairly recently, right? Where on the TED Talk, what'd she say? Something about
maiming and dumping women for sport.
Right. Yeah. And any gamer goes, we don't do that. There are no games that do this, right? And it drives you crazy to have that be your representation of a hobby that you love and a huge, big industry. Like you said, it's now bigger than Hollywood, right? It's bigger than the music industry. This games is big business, and to have it misrepresent that way almost feels like backlash. Like they're trying to say, hey, don't play games anymore, or games are kind of bad for people in a way to get people. I don't know. It feels targeted, and I think that's why I get upset. That's why I get I want to push back too. Yeah,
I think it is. I mean, a lot of Hollywood types, and it was actually a game developer named Ollie Barter who talks about this very eloquently. A lot of Hollywood types don't understand games, and so they're kind of afraid of them. And there was this whole movement to sort of cinemize games, make games very cinematic, which to me, it's like, no, I don't want to sit there with my DualShock battery dying through a 15-minute cutscene before I get to do F all in this game.
Right,
It is
right.
a game. I want to play the game. I don't want to watch a game. I want to play the game. But movies and TV have a whole reward system. There's a whole ecosystem. There's different ways to reward different types of products. Gaming doesn't have that maturation yet. And so, what do? We crow about our achievements in other media. BAFTA awards, for instance. BAFTA is, not a game award. And you see the things that get rewarded there. Some great games have won, but it's that Academy Award phenomenon where Raiders of the Lost Ark loses to Chariots of Fire. Does anybody remember Chariots of Fire anymore?
Right.
No. So these conventional award structures are quite bad at picking winners. But the other thing is that movie theaters are afraid. They see the halo effect. When a Halo game drops, box offices plummet because they're competing for the same audience. Shooters have a unique contingency of, as you pointed out in your videos, young men, right?
Right.
And movies also target young men. They're starting to pull away and appeal more towards women, but TV is much more a women's medium than film is. And so you're not going to open an Avengers film up against a Halo game. Both would suffer. It's the same audience, and people can't be in the same place at once. Now with the Nintendo Switch, maybe they can, but that remains to be seen. I mean, somebody could be sitting before the movies, playing Zelda and then put it away and watch a superhero movie. But there is a threat. I think right now we live in an age of fear in the media in general. Everybody seems to be afraid instead of having confidence that good products with the correct supports will find an audience. And gaming is such a huge success story for that, right? I mean, they've counted us out more times than I can probably recall right now. I mean, in the 70s, there was the whole moral panic over Dungeons and Dragons. And yes, that's not a video game, but it was sort of the prototype of the RPG structure that we enjoy in Western video games. In the 80s, there was Atari shock and everybody pronounced the industry dead, and then Nintendo backdoored it as a toy with the NES, and it came roaring back again. And then in the 90s, it was the moral panic over Doom and Mortal Kombat, and that was the first wave of regulation. That didn't work, thanks to, of all people, Antonin Scalia wrote the decision that games are protected speech, and therefore you have to actively prove a harmful social effect. And so where are we now? All these things are getting labeled harmful that are really just annoying or challenging. And I do my best in my own work to make the distinction between, I can personally not stand this character and this may actually cause social harm. I think you can tell I'm quite supportive of games in general. I'm quite bullish on them. I know that gaming really helped me define myself as an individual and feel good about the things that made me different in an age where we didn't have a lot of dynamic female role models. I mean, the 80s was the age of like the sitcom and the primetime soap opera. And women were sort of facilitators and enablers and support staff in these shows. It was the era of beefcake cinema in movies. It was the Stallone and Schwarzenegger era.
Right. Yep.
Right? But what was happening in games? We had the King's Quest games in the early 90s giving us playable female protagonists. We had women like Roberta Williams, Lori-Ann Cole, and Jane Jensen making games, and their names popped up in the credits. I remember seeing Ken and Roberta Williams in King's Quest back when I played on the old monochrome green monitor, and I'm like, oh, there's a woman doing this. This is cool. And then we got Lara Croft.
Right. And I'm glad you bring her up, because to me, Lara Croft has always been this, or should be, a feminist icon to me. Like, look at, she's coming forward and she's active. She's the player that you want to be, or the character that you want to be, right? And it's aspirational both for men and women, I believe, even though, she's a little sexualized, especially at first.
Well, why is that a bad thing, though. I
Yeah, I
mean,
don't think it's a bad thing either, but
it's funny because Lara was not intended to be. They were borrowing again from film, and this is a
right.
shining example of how techniques in film don't work. They were borrowing from the idea of Alien that put a woman in the leading role. The audience will feel protective towards her. That was the idea of Ripley. Well, of course, we saw what happened with Ripley. She became one of film's biggest badasses. But the
Right, right.
original intent was to inspire more empathy in the audience. Well, this is the difference between an audience and a player, because a player goes, this person is my avatar. This character is an extension of myself. I am not going to self-victimize. So what did players do? They zoomed in on her pointy boobs and found the funny
Right.
ways to use the ragdoll physics. It became this slapstick. Why? Because people were exploring the self through Lara Croft. It wasn't the same impact at all. But the thing I loved about Lara is, yes, she's aggressive. She likes the shiny. When it moved from core to crystal dynamics, the stories got more elaborate, and they settled on this idea of a Lara Croft narrative. And there are very few media properties anywhere that have, first of all, a female anti-hero. Lara Croft's a Byronic hero in that she's mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And she tends to get the physical goal she's searching for, but fail the moral war. You know, she's out to find Excalibur or explore the Arthurian myth to find out what happened to her mother. And she gets the shiny. So, okay, she's a great Indiana Jones type archaeologist, but her voyage of self-discovery ended hitting a wall. And the same thing happened with, the Bermuda Triangle thing they did, and I'm crossing the streams there. But this was a Lara Croft narrative. And this was powerful. And I'm getting ahead of myself here because I've got a series coming up on the various incarnations of Lara Croft, but it's important in media to have women who are aggressive, who aren't likable, who aren't cuddly, who aren't everybody's mom, who aren't going to pat you on the head and say it's okay and give you a cookie when you fall down, go boom. It's important to have these other types who are not the femme fatale. Lara Croft was taking a character who would normally be in that femme fatale role, which is, of course, helping to advance the plot of the protagonist instead of telling their own stories, and put her front and center. And that's freaking powerful in the history of feminist literature. It's up there with something like The Bell Jar, which explored the mental illness of women from the inside, as opposed to, the Ophelia route of, oh, there she is, she flops around and then throws herself off a balcony somewhere. We really
Right,
don't know
right.
why. We just know what the guy felt about it. And that's incredibly important. But what are we fighting over? The size of her boobs.
Yeah, which seems ridiculous to me, right? Like, I'm jumping ahead in kind of the questions I want to ask you too, but since we're talking about boobs,
One of
fun
my favorite
topic,
topics.
your
Yeah.
favorite topic. Well, you made a comment in one of your videos. It was the one with Simone de Beauvoir, right? Where you quoted Aristotle saying, let's see, what was it? That the feminine is the female is a female by a lack of certain qualities, and that you saw some application of that in the modern day representations of women in games. That they're defeminizing women in the interest of trying to make them what, more acceptable, or what's going on there?
Less threatening, right? I mean, let's face it. Let's call it for what it is. They are trying to make women less overtly female. They are slicing off the boobs of the fecundity goddess. If you go back to pre-patriarchal societies, there is art. First of all, there's porn everywhere. Both gay and straight, male and female pornography, but then they have these fecundity goddesses, the corn mother, the earth mother, and they tend to be, full breasts and wide hips, and sometimes even a distended belly.
Right, right.
Because
Yep.
it's motherhood. A lot of those, okay, women gave birth, and we see the earth gives birth to our food, And so the goddess is the earth and the god is the sun, and their ongoing cycle of copulation through the rain, semen metaphor, is how life gets going. And as things became more militarized, as people moved away from sort of hunter-gatherer and started fighting over resources, the goddess declined, and the gods, as a way of explaining why these, militarily superior societies were beating the pants off of the less, warlike places, well, the goddess declined, and the god moved up. Now, that's one reason that women disappear from media. In Elizabeth I was an anomaly in her time, in that she was a high-profile woman. At the time of Elizabeth's court, women weren't in the arts. The women in Shakespeare were played by men. There were no there's no such thing as this bathroom debate because there weren't female public washrooms in a lot of places. They had to be put in for women because women weren't expected to go out in public. Therefore, they didn't need the bathroom. And if you had to go, you found a sewer gate and squatted under your skirt. Like, I'm not kidding. Women were not participating in the public space. And so it is important from a feminist perspective for women to be seen as women, and body acceptance, breasts, this is a big deal. Instead, it's become co-opted, and the place we see boobs in media more than anything is places like HBO, that I claim stands for Hey Boobs Out. You tend to see the male protagonist, and what is it? He's on his back going, oh yeah, and there's this chick on top of him doing that. You never see that woman again. She is the deliverer of the boobs. And because those of us who want to celebrate women are going, oh God, no, no boobs,
Right.
no boobs. We're abandoning that space to the people who are actually using it as titillation for a primarily male audience. I mean, HBO is only getting into programming for women now. And I mean, they did it with Girls, and people are, Lena Dunham. Judd Apatow had a lot more to do with that show than people realize. He was the one, he gave an interview recently, he was the one that said they didn't want to make her look glamorous. They wanted to de-glam her, so they deliberately put her in clothing that doesn't fit. She's wearing bikini bottoms that are 2-3 sizes too small for her frame. And to me, this is continuing to warp the images women see about proxies for our own bodies. The idea that if you actually have a fat layer that squishes in when your friggin' string bikini is too tight, well, you're fat. Well, guess what? A healthy woman has a double-digit fat layer. 20 to 30% body fat is healthy, but that means you've got a fat layer of under an inch, which is gonna squish in. But guess what? You need that as a fuel store to reproduce. And so our images of womanhood are getting increasingly less healthy or more self-loathing. And then you jump over into video games, and let's face it, a big problem we have over here is they're putting boobs on male wireframes.
Right, yeah.
They're reusing that animation, and so it looks weird because you've got women in video games tend to look like Charlize Theron because she's incredibly broad-shouldered. So there's this crazy, at here, the female character sticking out to here, but then you go down to the bottom, and
There's like no hips. They're like square. Yeah.
the pelvic bone is clearly male, because in order to design that properly, you have to pull the whole thing out, which changes the gait, right? Which is
Right.
a skinning nightmare. Nothing works the same way. And I've just been marveling over Horizon Zero Dawn, just because it's one of the first games I've seen where the clothing over Aloy's body actually moves like clothes. It's not just a skin painted on. And I'm marveling by the way it kind of folds at her waist. I was like, they're finally able to do that because they built a woman that looked like a woman from the ground up. And I still think she's a little thin for what she's attempting, that upper body strength you'd expect, having done acrobatics and competitive dance. I know how big you bulk up. I would have liked to see more of that. I would like to see Tomb Raider stop having Lara go out in Siberia without a coat or climb rocks barefooted, but these are not about her body type. This is not about her boobs. We know that, for instance, the much maligned wage gap is much deeper for Hispanic and African American women than it is for Asian women or white women. Hispanic women, black women, they hover at around the 60 cent for every dollar a man makes mark. And if you look at those cultures, traditionally they have more overt sexuality. The body type is larger in the bust and larger in the hip. We have an issue with women and sexuality and being able to see those women as anything else. And this is something we really need to consider. We need to start putting these women who don't, cup size is not character. And the fact that somebody like Christina Ricci is reducing her, I think she was like a double D cup. She got a boob job to reduce the size of her breast so she could get better parts. Because they don't cast women with big boobs in lead roles. We are sending the message that women who are built a certain way, and I am one of them, these things grew on my chest the own way. I cosplayed Ivy Valentine in part to go, no, her proportions are not that impossible. I'm living proof. But
or Wonder Woman, right? Wonder Woman is with the UN, right? Backing away from that.
Why? Because she's and this is, again, this fear of nudity. Going to the doctor is uncomfortable enough without feeling like disrobing is some kind of moral problem.
Right, yeah.
We see, just because we've seen certain men in media with their shirts off, do we assume that is some moral judgment on that? Are they, loose? Are they cheap? Are they stupid? Are they debasing themselves? No, they just took their shirt off. Does anybody judge Chris Hemsworth negatively because he's shirtless Thor? No, he can still go on to do these other jobs. Whereas if there's naked pictures of a woman, this causes a problem for her in politics, in hard news, as any sort of intellectual thought leader. That's blackmail material. And Arnold Schwarzenegger did naked posing for a gay men's magazine back in the 70s, and he ended up as governor of California. And there are people that argue me on this, and they cite exceptions that prove the rule. An occasional, person who did adult films who ended up as a congressperson or like a local politician. But those are the exceptions that prove the rule. We all know the number of women who have been publicly shamed by sexualized material, and this is a big part of our life. This is something that we should be exploring. And if we, as so-called feminists, and this is the difference between the sex negative and the sex positive movements, if we start condemning female sexuality and wanting to shove it in the closet and marginalize our bodies and marginalize the fecundity goddess, then these problems are going to continue. In fact, they're going to be made worse, because then the people that might subconsciously be not totally comfortable with an attractive woman in any room where they're trying to think, they now have ammunition to keep us out. I mean, I was doing entertainment programming, and for years and years and years, the problem was I wasn't pretty enough. Then I come over to gaming, and now I'm too pretty? What the I'm a ginger. I have no souls, people. Like, compared to what? Lindsay Lohan, Little Orphan Annie, and Pippi Longstocking? Like, are you comparing me to Scully from the X-Files? What does this mean, too pretty, not pretty enough? This is a subjective thing. And so my attitude is, and this goes for a lot of things, and I won't go too far into this because I don't want to steal another question from you, but if women look like it in the real world, we should see it in games. If men look a certain way, in the real world. We should see it in games. And I think Ubisoft is creating a really great catalog of bodies right now just because they own that motion capture studio. And so they're just creating like an encyclopedia of body types that they can throw in crowds. And wow, does it up the realism. When you're walking through, Watch Dogs 2 blew my mind. You're walking through the streets of San Francisco, and there's people of all shapes, sizes, and colors, accents, voices. In the Assassin's Creed game, they expose you to different languages. It does increase the immersion. It does create the belief that you are there much more than
everybody being a stick figure, sort of.
The Thunderbird. They all look like marionettes. That was my one big complaint about the BioShock games, the way the characters moved. Those portraits were way more powerful to me. It didn't hit that uncanny valley because,
right.
Tannenbaum had an interesting face and Suchong had an interesting face, but they couldn't animate those back then. And so normally when you saw a main character, they were a corpse. I think in part because they didn't want the GoldenEye thing. Oh, there's James Bond. His face is shaped like an almond. They were up against the wall in terms of technology. But we're beyond that now. The processing power is so good that you can get realistic looking people. And so other than people who are trying to please this mass audience, and so they're seeing things as the way you have to do it because it's the way it's always been done, there's no excuse for not having more interesting faces in gaming, and it seems that we're kind of going backward in that regard, in some regards. I don't know if you saw the whole Mass Effect Andromeda thing that people are going, that looks a lot like the dude they hired, but not the woman they hired. And that is the othering that Simone de Beauvoir was talking about. When you start treating your female characters differently, notably differently than your male protagonists, that is what she called othering, which is an existential concept, meaning man is normal. Man is the thing, and in gaming, it's white man. The bald space marine is the thing that everyone else is judged against. And everyone else has this relational identity from the norm. And so the norm does not have to explain themselves. De Beauvoir described it as she has to start every conversation as saying, well, I feel this way, this is my position. And then somebody would say, well, you feel this way because you're a woman. And she said, and disagree with her or not, but the core of her sort of philosophy was, it would be inappropriate for me to fire back, well, you disagree because you're a man. Because man is the norm. Man is allowed to be an individual. And so this was one of the things that is so interesting. And you see it in media all the time. You have 3 white guys on a panel who are just speaking for themselves and their opinions and the other things that they bring to the table. And then you have the woman who has to speak on behalf of all women. And then you have the black guy who has to speak on the entire African-American community. Sometimes they're the same person. You see episodes of Real Time with Bill Maher when they're talking about how women feel about trans women being in bathrooms. There's not a single woman on that panel. Why are you talking about this? Women don't sit around and talk about what they think men should do with their scrotums. We have no point of reference.
Right.
There are so many completely avoidable mistakes if developers would just start talking to people earlier in the design process, like right at the beginning, when you're actually doing your systems. There's too much focus on character and story in terms of inclusion. We're not focusing on game systems because we don't have the tools, right, to focus on game systems. We're all using this, what does this character mean? What is this character's agency? Well, the character's agency isn't the only thing to consider in a video game. In a movie, yeah, that's absolutely true. But you've got the player agency, what the player can and cannot do with the product, and then the developer's agency, which is, what the developer has the power based on technical capability, but also artistry to allow and disallow the player to do. So you've got this triangle of character agency, developer agency, and player agency. And if those things aren't working in harmony, people are not going to click with your game, and they're not going to know why. You know, when you play a game like Gone Home and you can't even look in the mirror and see your own face, that is off-putting to a lot of gamers. And I think that's part of the reason a lot of people had this ugh response to it. Meanwhile, you play a game like The Darkness, and as somebody who is not male and is sick of hearing male voices and allegedly silent protagonists, shut up, Booker, I don't care what you think. This is first person, it's about what I think. I'm Booker DeWitt in BioShock Infinite. But in The Darkness, you're Jackie Estacado, who's this mob boss, but you can walk up and you can look in a mirror and you can see that face. And when you're playing Outlast and you look down and you see Miles Upsher's sweater, those are character points, because then you go, okay, in this game, I'm wearing a sweater. That tells me something about who this guy is. It's not a leather jacket. I don't have a gun holster. I'm not wearing motorcycle boots. I'm a dude that wears a granny sweater. Oh shit, this just got a lot scarier. You know, these things are so important, but these are systems things, right? These are what we want the player to do.
So I kind of want to provide a little bit of a counterpoint, and I've actually thought about doing a video just on this topic, that when we're making games as developers, a big part of that I think gets forgotten is that there is an ROI involved here, right? There's a return on investment. And you're always thinking about, well, who's my target audience out there? Who is going to play this game? And sometimes...
And everyone is not an option. That's
right.
What people don't recognize. You can't pitch a game saying it's a game for everybody.
Right, exactly. You have to figure out who am I targeting this to. And if it is, you know, that action straight white male gamer group, which is, you know, a pretty big group, that's, you know, that's a large population, okay, well, then you start making decisions.
You're underplaying it. It's the biggest group.
Well, it's the biggest group for that certain type of game.
That's right.
That's right. For that type of game. There are other so the reason that, you know, I bring that up is you know, I'll see these criticisms like, well, why didn't they have more female characters? Why isn't there a female playable avatar? Are women too hard to animate, right? You get that sort of thing. And my thought is, well, as a developer, they probably thought about that, went through the numbers and said, well, we could do that, but it's going to cost us a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of script. We're going to have to record stuff. Will we get a return on investment on that? Will our target demographic buy more units or this, or will we get better reviews if we do that? And so it's really a cost of benefit thing. So whenever you know, a game does do that, like Mass Effect, I think needs to be celebrated because they have, you know, Shepard, and then they have well, both of them. They have the male and the female version of Shepard. That is a big deal. I know from a game development standpoint, right? You have to be voiced. You have to go through, and there's special scenes and all that. They should be celebrated because they've expanded. They've reached beyond their core demographic. And then in other cases where we say, well, why didn't they include that? Is it because they're too hard to animate? Well, sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it's like that there's a cost involved there. Think of the business realities on this. And it's not because there's sexism they're trying to exclude. It's because they're trying to make money, and there's real cost involved. Anyway, I got to throw that out. So
no, and I completely agree with you on this, and this is something that needs to be talked about. And this is the frustrating thing on the media side, on the analytical kind of journalism side, although I don't call myself that anymore. It's really difficult to get access to people to have these discussions. And I think it is so critically important. The one thing I hear from devs over and over again is the public needs to know more about the game design process. And then, will you go on the record? No, PR won't let me.
Yeah, and PR is a big barrier. Yeah.
This is a huge issue. It's so frustrating to go to these junkets and have people, you know, go on about, oh, they give you the same stump speech that has been approved by PR about their game. And it's like, okay, that doesn't tell me anything. You know, this doesn't, gaming lives in a world where we speak in jargon. You know, a first-person action-adventure MMORPG, blah, 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 blah. What does that mean to a regular person? Nothing. And that's why people get fixated. People understand a character. People understand a story. These systems, they do not understand. For instance, Horizon Zero Dawn being criticized by some people for not having enough RPG elements. Well, the game is not an RPG, the game is an action RPG,
Right.
and so people compare it to The Witcher 3, and it's not the same game structurally at all. And so there's this, because we keep looking at games like movies, we keep missing these design choices. And
Right.
the God of War series is one I think is really educational in this way, because they deliberately made this big, powerful, beefy guy, war hero with scars and stuff and
Right. Right. He's a
swords,
demigod. Yeah.
all these symbols of power. And he has no agency within the game world. He's controlled not just by the player, but by the gods. Everyone around him is going, dance, monkey, dance. And what did they do? They gave the game a female narrator, which doesn't cost a cent more.
Right.
And of course, then it turns out to be Gaia in the second game. But right from the beginning of that franchise, it had a female narrator. And the women in Kratos' life are so significant. And that, goes back to the fact that, Greece had Athena as well as Zeus. They had Demeter as well as Ares and all that stuff. And they included that in their game. And there are ways of, because let's face it, men like women.
Right. Right. Of course
And
they do.
the average gamer it fluctuates between 30 and 38. So these games aren't being made, especially these mature rated games, are not being made for the girls are icky set. They're being made for, I have female colleagues, I have a girlfriend, I have a wife, I have daughters, I have a dog, I have a cat, my wife helps me feed this, And I think that even when you're talking about a game for straight men, that's super important, because guys want to see themselves reflected in games too. And I hear from gamers a lot, women complain about a lack of representation, but I'm not a space marine either. I'm a fat white guy who gets called a misogynist neckbeard. I don't see myself in games much either, except as, one of those monsters that tend to sit and barf at you. You that big ching, ching, ching,
Right.
ching
Yeah.
type enemy. He's going to spit puke. That's probably going to be acid, because it's gluttony. It's the 7 deadly sins that game monsters are based on. And this is the conversation we need to have. Yes, cost is a real thing. And I personally think God of War couldn't be made with a female protagonist. They did it. It was called Heavenly Sword, but it was a completely different story,
Right.
right?
Right.
God of War is a story about a guy who has a specific story. Uncharted is a story about a particular guy. When a game is third person, I think that people have to be prepared for that no matter who you pick there, and we can get into intersectionalism. I know you want to get into that, but
Right. Right.
maybe we can round out the first pack as kind of saying the minute you go third person and you don't have character customization, which is the way adventure games all the way back have worked, then you do create an intersectional character who is a combination of things, and you have to choose. Are they male? Are they female? Are they white? Are they black? Are they Asian? Are they Indian? One of the big unsung significant things in the first Assassin's Creed game is you had a Middle Eastern man as your secondary protagonist, and then you had a mixed race guy in Desmond Miles as the guy that first 3 games revolved around. That everybody forgets about that because people think Assassin's Creed, they think Ezio. When it started with Altair, it was retelling the Crusades from the part of the point of view of the Hashashim, the assassins. And the franchise did well enough to get a second game, so that isn't necessarily going to put gamers off. I didn't hear gamers complain, oh, I don't want to play a brown guy. I heard, well, the chase mechanics were glitchy as